Good afternoon. Delighted that you are here with us this afternoon. We've got students from ECE. We've got members from other parts of the University of Waterloo, and we have guests from the broader community as well, which is fantastic, and delighted that you've chosen to join us. Welcome to you all. My name is Ian Rowlands. I'm a faculty member in the Faculty of Environment here at the University of Waterloo and also a member of WISE. And it gives me pleasure to introduce our speaker to you this afternoon. And he is Tom Chapman, who's with the Markets Group at the Independent Electricity System Operator. And Tom has had over 20 years of experience in the energy industry, and this experience has ranged across private, public, and consulting roles, both in North America and in Europe. He came to Canada about 10 years ago now, working in Ontario, worked for the Ministry of Energy for 7 years, and just over a year ago joined the Independent Electricity System Operator. And there he's responsible for market design and development. Well, we certainly live in interesting times with respect to energy in Ontario. We'll see it as news items in the financial pages, in the business pages, the news pages, maybe even the gossip and sports pages, one never knows. And it's very much the case that energy is at the top of many people's agendas. We're very fortunate that we've got an insider's perspective and view today, as Tom will share with us some thoughts around a title of Demand Response and Capacity Auctions for Ontario. He'll speak for about 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll have a chance for a Q&A and discussion afterwards. So please join me in welcoming Tom Chapman. Tom, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks for the introduction. And as you can see, Ian and I are very close. We share a microphone. And I've worked with Ian on a number of projects over the years, and I always appreciate his support and the opportunity to come and speak to you here today. I also want to thank Claudio, the WISE Institute, for giving me this opportunity to speak to a different audience. Normally, when in the sector, when we normally speak to at public sessions, it's usually in front of stern-faced stakeholders with a lot of money on the line, and there's a lot of arguing and things. So hopefully there's not going to be a lot of arguing and confrontational discourse today. I hope to share some insights about the organization I'm with, the IESO. I'd like to talk about some of the projects we're working on, as well as some of the reasons why we're working on those projects, some of our goals and objectives. And I'm hoping that by the end of the session, you'll get a better sense of who we are and what we do. I suppose I should just clear the air at this point in time. I was advised against this, but I don't have an engineering background. I did grow up in a family of engineers, so maybe that's a little bit helpful, but I am an economist by training, and feel free to leave the room right now if you like. I did take the dark path growing up, but I do feel privileged to have worked in this sector at an organization like the IESO that has built its reputation on the backs of some fantastic engineers who've really done an amazing job in putting together the systems and the processes and procedures that basically keep the lights on and keep the province going. So I hope you bear with me as an economist. You might get a sense of my economist background as we go through some of the slides, but maybe it'll just also give you a bit of a different perspective. So I think that's enough about me. Here's what I'd like to do today. I'd like to talk a little bit about the organization I work for, the IESO, what we do, what's it all about. I'd like to talk about the role of IESO-administered markets. As an organization, we manage and facilitate a number of markets in the electricity space. And I think as I go through that material, hopefully it'll give you an understanding of why that's important for Ontario and why that makes for a sensible approach to managing the electricity system. I want to spend some time, maybe the second half of the talk, talking about the projects Ian referred to. So specifically, some of our projects we have around demand response. That's getting more loads or consumers into the marketplace, as well as this notion or idea of a capacity market, something that exists in other markets in the US and elsewhere, but doesn't exist in Ontario today. And so finally, hopefully, after going through this material, you'll have a better sense of, again, as I'm going through the explanations of who we are and what we do and the role in markets, you'll get a better sense and appreciation for the organization that I work for. And as Ian said at the end, opportunities to ask questions, and the material will be available after this talk. So here's what we do, and really the ISO is a very focused organization. It's the Independent Electricity System Operator. First of all, we are independent. We're not owned by a generator. We're not owned by consumers. We're a not-for-profit organization, and we've been set up specifically to run the markets in Ontario, to run the wholesale energy markets, and to ensure that reliability is maintained in the province. And we run those markets on behalf of consumers and suppliers. As it says in the title, electricity is very important to us. It really is our sole focus. We are interested in what's happening in the rest of the economy because it impacts the electricity market. We're certainly interested in what's happening on the technology front because, again, it impacts the electricity market. We're very interested in understanding what's happening at the policy level in government, carbon pricing, and we've seen the impact of government policies such as the phase out of coal-fired generation in Ontario, because that has a big impact on the electricity market. We also take an interest in other industries, such as the natural gas sector. Natural gas, for example, is a very important fuel for electricity generation, so what happens in the natural gas industry has a direct relationship in the electricity market. So although we are focused on electricity, we do take an interest in the broader economy and other markets. One of the things that, as an organization, we do a lot of is planning. We recently joined forces with an agency called the Power Authority, the Ontario Power Authority. Historically, the IESO has always done short-term planning. So we're taking into account outages at generators into our demand forecasts so that we can manage the system to meet supply and demand. And with the merger with the OPA, we've managed to bring the long-term planning, and now it's all under one roof. So we have a combination of the short, medium, and long-term planning function, as well as a procurement function to bring on sources of supply. We also take a big role, or we have a big role, in meeting the provincial conservation policy objectives. These are laid out, and if you're interested in conservation, there's a lot more material on our website and on the government's, the Ministry of Energy's website. But conservation has been presented as a cornerstone of our future of our electricity system. So we want to rely on conservation wherever we can, and as an organization, we're trying to facilitate more conservation in the system. So that's really what we do as an organization. We're an independent electricity system operator, and we're one of a number of system operators across North America. So it doesn't just exist in Ontario, these exist in other markets and other jurisdictions. A couple of facts and figures about Ontario, and you may be familiar with these. And what I'm hoping you take away from this slide is that we're not a really large market, and we're not a really small market. We're basically a mid-sized market. We're a very big province in terms of land mass, much bigger, much bigger than, say, New York or New England. But in terms of our electricity consumption, our peak demand of around 25,000 megawatts is what I would characterize a mid-sized market. It's in the ballpark of New England, New York. Their peak demand is a little bit higher than ours, somewhere in the region of 30 to 35,000 megawatts. But we're nowhere near as big as these markets, the MISO and PJM. Their peak demand is more like 150,000 megawatts, so 5 or 6 times the size of the Ontario marketplace. And on either side of us, we have Hydro-Quebec and we have Manitoba. Manitoba's over here, and Hydro-Quebec. Hydro-Quebec still has a lot of electric heating in the province, so it's still a major electricity consumer. It has a peak demand of around 40,000 megawatts, or just under 40,000 megawatts. So it's substantially bigger than Ontario, but certainly not as big as some of those US markets. And I think what's also important is that all these markets operate as individual markets for their own particular jurisdiction, but we also operate very closely, very coordinated as a regional whole. In fact, whenever we have a reliability issue in Ontario, our neighbors will be notified so that we can call upon them for emergency sales of power, for example. Just before Christmas, Hydro-Quebec had a big issue with one of its HVDC lines coming down from the hydro generation in the north, down to the load centers on the Montreal and Ottawa. The entire line was taken out, and they called upon Ontario to provide them with emergency power. And we scrambled, our control room scrambled to ensure sources of supply in Ontario were being sent across the interties here to support our neighbor in Quebec. So although we operate, the bulk of the time for our own needs, we're very much part of this interconnected regional grid, and we all look out for each other to maintain reliability. We certainly don't want to see situations that we saw just over 10 years ago, just before I joined Ontario, when we had the blackouts in 2003. I suppose I have the dubious claim to fame that there hasn't been one since I've been in Ontario. Because we have these regional responsibilities, all of the individual ISOs or market operators, they fall under the jurisdiction of a North American Electricity Reliability Council. And we all have to meet reliability standards as part of our broader responsibility. So that's really the Ontario electricity marketplace, and that's where we as an organization operate. One final slide in terms of who we are and what we do, and this just provides a slightly different perspective on what we should do. Our responsibilities are laid out in legislation, specifically the 1998 Electricity Act, and there's a section in there, it's the objects of the IESO, and that's just a legalistic way of saying this is what you need to do in order to comply with the law. And I just wordled the objects of the Electricity Act, of the ISO and the ISO objects in the Electricity Act, and a couple of words really jump out at you as being significant. Clearly, we're all about electricity, and I don't think that's any surprise. I mean, we are the electricity system operator. But the next most prevalent word was engage, and this isn't something perhaps that you would naturally associate with a system operator. But a large part of the work that we do, a large part of our organization, whether it's operations, whether it's markets, whether it's procurement, contracting, is engaging with the broader sector. A large part of our resources, our time and our efforts are spent in consulting with the suppliers, consulting with consumers, consulting with government, consulting with industry on design changes to the wholesale market, market reforms, market evolution, issues that emerge in the marketplace. And we also engage and consult with our colleagues in other markets in the US. So engagement is a huge part of what we do. So it's not just about sitting in the control room and making supply and demand balance. We are out there in Ontario at conferences and special stakeholder events, talking to consumers and suppliers about the work we're doing and trying to understand their concerns and their interests too. Some of the other things are more straightforward. Reliability. Clearly we have a big reliability focus. That's really our number one operational job. And we're focused on Ontario, but not to the extent that we, as I was mentioning earlier, that example with Hydro-Quebec, not to the extent that we're putting other markets in jeopardy. We're very interested in sources of power, and I'll talk a little bit about our changing supply mix, how we've gone from a coal-dependent province a few years ago to one that's increasingly has large amounts of renewable generation on the mix, as well as the hydro and the nuclear that really support the system. And conservation, that's one of our priorities of the new organization, the new ISO, and it's something we spend a lot of time on. So this really just provides a little bit of a different perspective on some of the description I gave earlier about what the ISO does. So this is the control room. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the wholesale energy markets, and this is sort of the meat and potatoes of what the organization does on a 5-minute basis, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So we have a control room in Mississauga. We have backup control rooms, but I can't tell you where they are because there's a certain amount of secrecy that goes along with that. In fact, I don't even know where one of them is. So this is our control room. It's staffed with about 50 operators. They're all certified reliability operators. They go through extensive training. They go through many years of, they're all engineers. Economists such as myself aren't actually allowed in the control room. You have to be an engineer to go in there. And I'm only really half joking about that. you have to be a certified reliability operator to touch anything in the control room. It's really, the control room, you have incredible power over electricity supply in the province. You could take out Toronto with a touch of a button. You could take out Bruce nuclear power if you wanted to. Not that you will want to, but you have that ability to really control huge quantities of energy, where it flows to, across which transmission lines, across into which markets. You have the ability to schedule trades across the interties. You have the ability to curtail those trades across the interties if certain rules are breached. So the control room is where everything happens. And as I said, there's staffed by about 50 reliability operators, and they're divided into 6 crews, and there's 7 people per crew, and they operate 24/7 around the clock. The control room is always busy. So what do they do? Every 5 minutes, the ISO, as an organization, is automated. They forecast the demand in the province, and the job of the control room, although again we have a system that does this for us, is to schedule and dispatch generation resources to meet demand every 5-minute interval. And we do that by building up a stack from the lowest cost to the highest cost to basically, as an economist, this is where sort of I come into the equation. We want to make sure that we're supplying power to the province to meet our demand forecast at the lowest cost, marginal cost basis. The marginal cost being the cost of providing 1 extra megawatt, incremental megawatt of power to meet demand. And this is done every 5 minutes. Each 5-minute interval is then collated into 12 5-minute intervals, and we establish what's known as an hourly Ontario energy price. And if you're an active participant in the market, if you're a generator or you're a large industrial consumer, you'll see those hourly prices, and you'll be able to either generate or respond accordingly. So it's a very dynamic marketplace. The prices are high, you'll see a very different mix of resources at any one moment in time consuming and supplying. And if prices are very low, again, you'll see a very different mix of suppliers and consumers taking power out of the system at that time. So the control room really manage what is a $14 billion annual market. So it's a sizable marketplace in pure dollar terms. About $14 billion worth of power is cleared through the wholesale market. And that includes contracted generation, which is, still has to flow through the marketplace. Every megawatt that's produced in Ontario flows through the wholesale market. Every megawatt that's consumed by consumers in Ontario is bought from the wholesale market. Everything flows through the wholesale market, and everything flows through the control room and those 50 operators. So there's about 5 million consumers that rely on the wholesale market to deliver their power. And there's about 34,000 megawatts of generation of different types, different forms, different technologies that is on the system at any moment in time, ready at the various different price points to supply power to meet the needs of those consumers. And I thought I would just take you through an example of how the market works in practice. And this, as I was putting these slides together last week, I just pulled up some data on our website, and this data is available for anybody who's interested. You can go and you can see right now, even on a smartphone, you can see what's happening on the electricity system in real time. And so this shows the Ontario demand over the course of, well, it's not a complete week, but it was last week. And you can see two lines on this chart. The lower line is Ontario demand, and you can see it's volatile, but there is a pattern to it. You can see there's peak demand periods. Let's see, there's a peak demand period, there's an off-peak period, a low demand period. So this is typically overnight when industry and consumers were not using a lot of power. The demand was around 15,000 megawatts. That's actually reasonably high for a low demand period. There are times of the year in May and September when the weather is mild and there isn't any heating being used, when our lowest demand periods could be around 10,000 megawatts. And that can be a problem when you have 11 or 12,000 megawatts or 15,000 megawatts of baseload nuclear and hydro on the system producing power. You have to manage 15,000 megawatts of supply that can't really be moved, with 10,000 megawatts of demand. And that's one of the challenges our control room is having to deal with in those periods. The line above is very similar, but it's at a higher demand amount, and that's our market demand. So that includes the demand from consumers outside of Ontario. And they're attracted to Ontario because we have a lot of low-cost, marginal cost power in Ontario. Our baseload hydro, our baseload nuclear, or the wind generation has a very low marginal cost. So they're attracted to the Ontario marketplace, and they're consuming power from our wholesale market, and they're shipping it across the border into New York, New England, PJM, Quebec, for example. Quebec will buy our power overnight, and they may sell it back to us during the day. And so it makes for a very active, dynamic marketplace, not just in the Ontario market, but across these boundaries and borders too. So this is just to show you that at any moment in time, the demand follows a fairly regular pattern. It's quite correlated to temperature, the time of year, and things like that. But there is variation. A couple of days ago, well, I'll get to a situation where there was some variation. In fact, there was a variation during this time period. So this is the same time period, which shows the demand. And now I'm focused on the market demand, going up and down. And this shows what sources of supply were on the system at any moment in time to meet that market demand. This chart doesn't show imports and exports. So if there's any clever people in here who says the numbers don't quite add up, they don't. I know that. They don't add up, so you don't need to tell me about it. Let's just treat this as illustrative, and it's, again, shown on our website. And you can quite clearly see that we're very heavily reliant on nuclear power. Right now, it makes up, on this time frame, about over 50% of the supply during that week was coming from nuclear power. And that's very consistent with what nuclear does on an annual basis. It currently supplies around 50% of all our power needs. Then you can see a strip of blue, and that's our hydro resources. And some of that hydro is run-of-river. It must run. There's environmental reasons why it can't be managed and spilled. There's other hydro that is more flexible and can be stored behind reservoirs or can be stored behind a cascading river system that mean that you can shape it to meet, say, a morning ramp or when you're coming off the highs of the day. And then you can see the dark blue is the gas, and we actually use gas on a very frequent basis. We have about 10,000 megawatts of gas on the system. It's a reliable, flexible, clean source of supply, and we really use it to meet changes in demand. So we can have the gas plants running. They're flexible, but they're not as flexible as maybe our former coal fleet. They have higher minimum loadings than the coal fleet did. So they are very flexible once you have them operating at around 50–60%, and you can ramp them up and down at fairly good rates. And we use them to meet our morning ramps and, again, coming off our daily highs. And then the green is the renewables. So you can see that all the action over the last couple of years to bring on wind and solar is starting to show up in the supply. And we currently meet about just over 5% of all our supply needs from renewable generation. Sometimes it's producing more power than others, and that's just the nature of renewables. If the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, then obviously those facilities can't be producing power. But there are times when it's a really good contributor to meet our system needs. And the other thing I'll show on this, just to show the interaction of supply, demand, and price, is the red line, which is market prices. And you can see for the vast bulk of this period, the prices, which are shown on the right-hand side, were very low. I mean, I didn't look at them specifically, but they were in the $20 to $30 a megawatt hour level, which is consistent with a low natural gas price. And natural gas is usually the marginal fuel on the system. The nuclear and the hydro typically are very lower cost than the natural gas. But you'll notice that there was two big price spikes on January 29th. The first one was at 7 o'clock in the morning. And this will just maybe explain some of the sort of the work that our control room does. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Darlington G4, so one of the big units at Darlington, went down. There was an issue with transportation, a heat transport leak. This resulted in a loss of about 940 megawatts of power from the system. 940 megawatts is a lot of power. that's a huge, in fact, our contingency is based on the loss of a large nuclear power unit. So we lost that unit unexpectedly. It just disappeared from the stack. So our control room had to figure out how we're going to make up for that shortfall without impacting consumers, because as a last resort, you'd have to instigate some sort of voltage reductions, or maybe take down power in certain parts of the province where you weren't able to supply it. So what they did during that time frame, they sprung into action, and they put their breakfast on one side at 7 o'clock. They looked at what they could do. They curtailed 400 megawatts of exports. So there were traders who had scheduled exports out of the province. They said, nope, Ontario needs that power. We can't let it go. 400 megawatts has to stay in Ontario. So they did that. They looked at our operating reserve. So this is like the backup generation reserve that we have on the system at all times. And they were able to schedule 400 megawatts of operating reserve for the next hour, hour 8. That was enough. That was just about enough, but prices started to shoot up in the wholesale market. And this is where you see the value of the price signals. The prices shot up and went up and up and up to the point where they started to attract the interest of some of our hydro facilities in the northeast. And a lot of those facilities only have very limited water reserve capability. So they really try and save their water for the highest priced hours of the year. And so they only really come on when prices touch $2 or $3 or $4 or $500 a megawatt hour, because if they use up their reserve when prices are low, then they're going to be missing out on opportunities when prices are high. So the price went up, and it attracted that hydro onto the system, and we got a bunch of northeast hydro dispatched to meet our demand, or the problem with Darlington going offline. And finally, York G1 and G2. And York is a peaking gas unit generator north of Toronto. Those units were started up. They're relatively inefficient. They're designed exactly to meet contingencies such as this, or to meet extreme peaks when you want a very reliable, flexible resource that could be brought on at a moment's notice. So we brought on a bunch of peaking gas units to meet the shortfall from Darlington. So that was good. We managed to restore the balance. An hour later, the whole thing happened all over again. So in this case, it wasn't Darlington going down. This was just a case of demand running at 600 megawatts more than we forecast. So we forecast demand, and actual demand ended up being a lot higher than we forecast. And the wind generation that we had predicted, or the data we were getting in, was running 250 megawatts lower than they were forecasting. So we had a 850 megawatt gap to fill. And we went through a similar exercise. In this case, we were able to use exports and activate operating reserve to meet the shortfall. But maybe hopefully that illustrates what sort of our control room is doing. They're always on the lookout. They're always monitoring these events. If there was a large generator that goes out, or a tie line goes down, or a transmission line, or a storm blows through, it's really up to them to make quick decisions in the control room about restoring balance by activating all the tools that they have at their disposal. So let me just touch upon our changing supply mix. And from the previous chart, you could see there was no coal in the mix. And there is no coal as of 2015. The province has phased out all its coal-fired generation. In fact, it's now illegal to burn coal for the purposes of generating electricity in Ontario. And that was a situation where the government made a policy decision that impacts everybody. It means, to a certain extent, additional costs, because coal was a relatively cheap resource, and we had to replace it with other forms of generation. But it also means that we get a whole bunch of environmental benefits. We're able to reduce the emissions from the electricity sector by about 90%, and which really helped the province meet some of its important GHG targets. And we're the first jurisdiction globally that we're aware of that's taken the bold step of going from a significant amount of coal to zero. And as the system operator, you can imagine the engineers in the control room taking away one of their most flexible sources of supply, and they were left thinking, how can we deal with that situation like we had last week when Darlington went down, when we're now without one of our most flexible sources of supply. And at the same time, we're doubling their misery by not only taking away their most flexible tool in the toolbox, we're bringing on vast sums of renewable generation, wind and solar. And again, this is a provincial policy objective. And we didn't just replace coal with wind and solar, we replaced coal with natural gas, and we replaced it with refurbished nuclear as well as conservation. Each of the different resource types played its role in eliminating coal. But wind and solar has been integrated into our system in ever-increasing amounts. And we're at 2015, and in 2015 we're going to get another 2,000 megawatts of wind and solar being brought onto the system. And as I was driving up here from Toronto, and there was a big hold-up on the 401, and there was trucks shipping wind turbine blades. I don't think they were the cause of the hold-up, but they were certainly caught up in the traffic jam. And you can see that the amount of wind and solar, the capacity, is going to accelerate over the next couple of years, and I think it even goes on beyond 2020 into the 2020s. So we're bringing on a lot of wind and solar, and we're taking out coal. And as you know, with wind and solar, it's intermittent. It's not easy to predict when it's going to be generating in large amounts, and that's something our control room has to manage as part of their actions. And this is the challenge with wind. So this is the actual wind data from 1 month in last year. We had about 2,000 megawatts of wind on the system. And as you can tell, the output is pretty random. And so you have a control room where they're trying to manage the voltage on the grid. They're trying to manage supply and demand on a 5-minute increment based on demand forecasts. And now they're being challenged with integrating large amounts of wind generation into the system. And with sudden surges in wind, you can go from 0 to 2,000 megawatts in the space of a couple of hours. You can see a sharp drop-off over the course of another hour. It's a very volatile, it has been a very volatile situation bringing on that wind generation. But we have although it has been tough to manage wind, especially if it's allowed just to operate whenever it wants to operate. But we engaged with, as I talked to earlier, we engaged with the sector, we engaged with the renewable generator community. We've put rules in place. We've made wind and solar above a certain size dispatchable. So now our control room can actually look at Kruger wind farm, or they can look at the Ripley wind farm, and they can say, we need you to go down, we need to dial you down, because if you don't go down, we're going to be taking off a nuclear generator, and if you take down a nuclear generator, it doesn't come back for 3 days. It's incredibly expensive, and there's all sorts of technical reasons why you don't want to be messing about with nuclear generators. So we're now in a situation where wind has gone from being a very volatile, unpredictable resource to being extremely responsive from the control room's point of view. A wind farm can turn down its megawatts very easily, very quickly. It's actually become quite a flexible resource in order to meet some of the morning ramp issues as you go through the morning period and demand is above or below your forecast. Wind is just one of those extra resources that can now be used to provide that flexibility in the system. So the outlook from the control room was first a bit of panic, but once we have the right rules in place and we can manage the wind output, it's turned into a completely different resource. And we're in a good space with our wind fleet. So, I'm an economist. You don't get away with no economics at all. That was really a little bit how we manage the system, what we do as the ISO, our control room, and how we manage the system in real time. I just want to spend a little bit of time now talking about my job, which is market design. So I'm responsible at the ISO for market design and development, looking at ways to improve the efficiency of the wholesale market that we have, looking at ways to improve the dynamic efficiency of markets in general, to try and drive efficiencies for consumers and suppliers alike. So I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but maybe this will give you a flavor of the sorts of things that we look at in the market and resource development area. So this is just an economics 101, supply and demand. So this is demand for electricity and supply of electricity, supply resources. And you'd have an equilibrium where the marginal cost of supply equals the price of supply.
The problem is that often, for example, you might be at this point where generators are offering into the marketplace and including some of their fixed costs in their marginal costs. So maybe they're including startup costs, maybe they're including ramp down costs, maybe they're including some capital costs. Costs that aren't marginal to get an extra megawatt of energy out of that facility. And if that's the case, and generators are including costs that otherwise shouldn't be in their marginal costs, we could be at a situation where wholesale prices are too high and we have an inefficient level of consumption. And what we have here in economics terms is called a deadweight loss. So my job is to try and eliminate these types of triangles, identify them and eliminate them. And they can occur on this side of the equation. They could occur here too. In this case, you could think of a generator that's being subsidized. So it's able to produce power at a price that's below its true marginal cost because it's receiving a subsidy. In which case, as a consumer, I'm consuming more than is optimal. And again, the market is inefficient. We have a bit of another deadweight loss. So there's many situations around the market design that lead to inefficiencies. And in the last 10 years, and I've only been at the ISO just over a year, but there's been many things that have been done to improve the efficiency of the market. We put in a day-ahead commitment process. We've looked at generator cost guarantees. We looked at ramp rates. We looked at optimization over multiple time horizons. The whole point of doing all of this is to try and get us to that green dot and to eliminate these various triangles wherever they emerge. And the other thing we look at is, from an efficiency perspective, and as an economist, we look at producer and consumer surplus. So we're trying to maximize consumer and producer surplus. We're not overly concerned about picking winners, making suppliers better off or making consumers better off. That's really not our job. Our job is to try and design an efficient marketplace that allows consumers and suppliers to interact in the most efficient manner possible. But certainly, it becomes quite controversial if you're putting in a design change that's going to result in suppliers being much better off and the generators making additional profits, or whether generators' profits are being eroded at the expense of consumers, and consumers are better off. So you can see how it can become much more complicated than just a simple exercise in pure economics. It becomes quite political. The other thing we'd like to do is try and increase participation, and we were talking about this over lunch, is increase participation in the marketplace, because right now we have 4 million consumers, about 140 terawatt hours of energy consumption, but there's only about 450 market participants in the market. Now those 450 market participants, they do account for a large portion of the total energy transacted through the marketplace, but you could also argue that this lighter blue area is an area of the market that doesn't see any price signals, doesn't have any reason to respond to a price signal today. None of you in here, I don't, Waterloo doesn't, Toronto doesn't, almost any low volume or small commercial consumer, even some of the larger commercials, don't see any price signals in the marketplace. So that spike that I talked about earlier, where the price was going up to $300, we only find out about it after the fact when it's on our bill. So one of the other things we want to try and do is to try and expose more consumers to those price signals to give them the opportunity to respond in a way that's economically efficient for them. And if we can do that, we can get more participation, more people responding to price signals, then it will increase the overall efficiency of the marketplace. And I'm really excited because for the first time in a long time, we're seeing technology really breaking down some of those barriers. So this is just another way of showing what we do at the ISO as the consumer, various appliances, and maybe they have some generation or an electric vehicle. This is the infrastructure where the energy gets transacted from the consumer to the system operator, that's us, and there's the generation on the left-hand side. Basically, there's a huge big brick wall that runs right down the middle of this, this chart here. Which means that you as a consumer aren't really able to transact with a generator today in any meaningful way. All you can do is pay your bill that you receive from Waterloo North Hydro, and that's about it. And if you don't like the bill, you can phone them up and complain, or maybe you can use the time of use rates to make some small changes. But you really don't have any ability to directly operate in the market itself. But increasingly, technology is developing. Smartphone technologies, the ability to communicate data and information, the ability, one when I was at the ministry, one of my projects there was called a Green Button project. And this was to basically enable consumers to download their own consumption data. And we had a competition for students and app developers to come up with really interesting ways to present that information and provide some value added to consumers. And it was a really, really good project. And I think it's just a sign of the things to come, that when you combine the data with the smartphone technology and intelligent devices and smart thermostats and things like that, you start to see a whole new dynamic emerge. A lot of those barriers for participation get eroded, and you can start to envisage a time when consumers can more directly participate in real time to respond to those price spikes that I was talking about. Maybe there's a signal that's sent from the market to, maybe you don't actually have to do anything at all. Maybe the signal is sent to your thermostat and it automatically adjusts to a lower demand in response to the price spike. So in that sense, you may have set the parameters around these various devices that you have in your house, and they all automatically adjust to the signal that's being generated, the supply and demand, and the price that's being set in the marketplace. And if we can make more of this happen, then we're really increasing the dynamic efficiency of the Ontario marketplace. It becomes a lot more efficient in the longer term. Now I'm really stretching things here, but I feel like I can. So we've seen in the last year, and you guys are probably more familiar with this than most of my colleagues in the sector, that's for sure. If I show this to my VPs and everything else, they all say, what the hell are you talking about? But the on-demand or the sharing economy is something that's really emerging leaps and bounds over the last 18 months. We've seen Uber, for example, get a valuation of $40 billion and $1 billion of investment, because what's it doing? It's creating a wholesale market for taxis. It's basically doing what we've been doing in the electricity sector for the last 10 years. We've been matching supply and demand, consumers and generators in the wholesale market for the last 10 years. What Uber has decided, unwittingly, is to copy our market design, generate huge sums of investment, make themselves incredibly rich by doing the same thing in the taxi industry. And you can't see it here, but if you go to the Uber website, there's a little section at the top that says, like, I think that's for drivers. Think of those as suppliers, like generation suppliers, and for users or consumers. And essentially, this is the same chart as the one I showed on the other page. It's connecting suppliers and consumers directly through a smartphone or new technology that has emerged recently to basically bypass an existing industry. Now, the good news for the electricity industry is that we thought about this, and we had in our crystal ball, we could see Uber coming on the horizon, and we put in place our wholesale energy market. What we have to do is to try and do what Uber's done, which is to enable this connection between suppliers and consumers more directly. And this is a real opportunity, because this hasn't actually been done effectively by anybody yet, as far as I'm aware, globally. So the first smart person that figures out how to do this, guarantee you're going to be the next multi-billionaire in the sort of technology world that we're living in today. Because, as I said, even in Ontario, this is a $14 billion sector. Across North America, it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So you just need to take a slice of that pie to become an incredibly successful business by connecting consumers and suppliers directly. So I'm pretty excited by the emergence of this on-demand economy, and you're starting to see it in the sharing economy, which is a completely different way of transacting services and goods. You might have solar panels on your roof, and somebody else may have an electric vehicle. Maybe you want to do a deal, right? Maybe you want your electric vehicle to be powered by solar power. So you could see those suppliers and those consumers coming together and forming a transaction or operating in a market-based environment. And that's another example of where you might see somebody come forward with a really interesting idea to enable that to happen. So unfortunately, I can't show an on-demand new technology startup for the energy sector because no one's done it yet, which is what's so exciting, because someone is bound to do it in the very near future. And maybe it'll be somebody from Waterloo, who knows? So going back to what my job is in market design, dynamic efficiency, getting greater participation in the marketplace. But I'm also very interested in ensuring that our wholesale market that we have can expand to integrate new technologies. We've done a very good job so far of integrating the wind, the solar, new forms of biomass, for example. But we're also seeing a whole new series of technologies emerging. Flywheels is one, energy storage. We've been doing a lot of work with the storage community to bring their technologies into the, store power off-peak and supply it on-peak. You can use it for voltage regulation services, for example. And there's battery storage, which if you combine it with the intermittent wind and solar, can provide a firmer energy product which has a lot more value potentially to the system. And on the other hand, you could see the wholesale market expanding to incorporate all these additional new technologies. But I'm also open to the idea that our wholesale market might actually contract, and that might be the right thing to happen. In fact, maybe it will contract as a wholesale market, and you'll see the emergence of mini-grids, like microgrids. So Waterloo has a grid, maybe Toronto has a grid, maybe the University of Waterloo has a grid. And they're all able to control the resources on their microgrid, and those microgrids can transact and interact with the wholesale market. So as a designer of a market, I have to be thinking ahead and thinking what the future might hold, and ensuring that all the rules we have in place, all the systems that we're building out, and all the protocols that we have and the arrangements and everything else are sufficiently flexible to adapt to this sort of changing world that we have. And that's where I think a market-based approach, and that's why I'm a proponent of market-based approaches, is they are just inherently a lot more flexible than going out necessarily and buying something off the shelf and locking it in for very long periods of time. And then it becomes incredibly hard to change something once you've bought it, you've installed it, you've signed a long-term contractual arrangement for it. There's very little ability then to flex and change to changing market conditions. So I see I've used up almost all my time on the background. I'm going to jump. We're working on a bunch of projects. I want to talk about capacity auction and demand response, but I'll just jump straight into the capacity auction. And here I just wanted to show you a quick video. You're gonna.
Today, Ontario benefits from a reliable and clean supply of energy, a result of investments in new power plants and transmission lines over the last 10 years. At the end of this decade, however, existing contracts with generators will begin to expire, and output from nuclear plants will decrease during refurbishments. As a result, future investments will be needed to maintain reliable service. Ontario's Independent Electricity System Operator, or IESO, is developing a capacity auction to meet some of these energy needs and to lower costs for consumers. The IESO runs Ontario's power system and wholesale electricity market. Its job is to ensure there's enough energy to meet demand 24 hours a day. Here's how the auction would work. To ensure future reliability, Ontario needs to have enough generation available to meet the highest energy demands with some extra in reserve. It's like a parking lot. There needs to be enough parking spots on the busiest days, knowing that at times there will be empty spaces. In the same way, the electricity system needs enough capacity to meet high demand during heat waves and cold spells. A capacity auction allows a range of suppliers to compete to offer the best price. Existing generators are able to offer additional capacity from existing facilities, and new forms of supply, such as demand response and storage, can also participate. Capacity auctions only apply for 3 to 5 years in advance, adjusting to changes in demand forecasts at a much lower cost than longer-term contracts. A capacity auction adjusts to changes in energy demands, provides transparency about costs, and inspires innovation, making the system work even better for consumers. To learn more about the capacity auction and join the discussion, please visit our website at ieso.ca/capacity auction.
It's just my heartbeat. Whoa. I wasn't supposed to do that, but it looks interesting. Okay, let's get back to... So that hopefully that just gives you, I know it's a very short intro into what a capacity auction is. And it's really just trying to introduce a competitive market-based mechanism to secure our future capacity needs. Maybe I'll just take this thing out and put it down here. Let's try that. And just in the interest of time, I won't go through a whole lot of these slides, but essentially, in the future, we're going to need additional resources. We don't need resources today. We actually have an adequate supply of resources on the system. But we're going to be taking down the Pickering nuclear generating station in a few years' time. We're going to be seeing load growth in some parts of the province. We're going to have a series of contracts from natural gas facilities will expire. So by the early 2020s, we're going to need between 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 megawatts of new supply on the system. And by the end of the decade, the 2020s, we might need between 10,000 and 12,000 megawatts. And when we looked at what our options are and how we might go about securing those resources, we could sign them up to contracts like the ones we already have with generators. And we could go for a more market-based approach. And we looked at the relative costs of doing each of those. This is what we currently pay for capacity. And most of you guys are all engineers, so you'll know the difference between capacity and energy. Capacity is being available to produce power. It's basically the size of the pipe versus the energy, which is the flow. So capacity is what we need to meet our peak demand. And the cost, right now we pay around $130,000 a megawatt year for capacity. But in other markets, they pay less than half of what we do. And the reason they do that is because they are able to secure capacity from existing assets. So instead of building on a greenfield site, a nice shiny new gas plant, for example, they may be able to get an uprate from an existing facility. Demand side might be able to offer into the market at a low price. They may be able to attract an import from a neighboring jurisdiction. There's a whole bunch of reasons that it's really hard to predict or forecast ahead of time. But the market, once you put that need out there, responds in a whole host of different ways. And they've been very successful in PJM, New York, New England, and MISO in
this is our test for you, Tom. You
Yes.
did very well. Do you want to turn it off, or is it...
Maybe I'll just turn it off and speak to the...
You passed the test with flying colors. Let it kick over there.
It's a thing of evil. Oh, that's better. So yeah, it's just an opportunity to reduce costs in the future. And those costs, when you spread them out over 10 to 12,000 megawatts,
could translate into savings for everybody here and our, the next generation of about $500 million a year. So we're not talking about pocket change, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars by going to a more of a market-based approach to securing our capacity needs. There's a lot of uncertainty about when we'll need those megawatts, about how many megawatts we need, and we think that's another reason why you want to go with a market-based approach. So you're not locking in resources based on a future need of 10,000 megawatts and building 10,000 megawatt gas plants if it turns out you only need 3,000 megawatts or 5,000 megawatts and you have a whole bunch of assets sitting there doing nothing, but we're still paying for them because we're contractually bound to do so. This is just a schematic of how a capacity auction works. And what would happen in the pre-auction period, we would identify how many megawatts we need to maintain reliability on the system. We would put forward a bunch of eligibility requirements and criteria. Resources would register to participate. We would have an auction, and it would be based on our systems. We would do an auction for 2 6-month commitment periods, so a winter period and a summer period. This is something we've already started stakeholdering with the sector, and we've had some interesting reactions from the generators, because this is going back to one of those earlier charts where we see the winners and the losers, like the consumers versus the suppliers. In this situation, you see quite a big transfer of profits from the suppliers to consumers. That $500 million of annual savings comes right out of the generators' pockets. So you can imagine it's potentially quite controversial if you're a supplier. However, having said that, there's also opportunities for suppliers that they might otherwise not have had. Then there'll be a forward period of 3 to 4 years. So we might be doing an auction in 2017 for 2020, 2018 for 2021. And you might have rebalancing auctions. So if supply and demand changes in the interim period, you would have like a true up to make sure that you had exactly the right amount of megawatts that you needed in a delivery year. And then in return for the capacity payment that you receive, this $100, $130, $50, $60,000 a megawatt year, you have to offer energy into our wholesale energy market. That's the trade. You get a payment, but it comes with it an obligation to offer your capacity into the energy market during peak periods. Now, the price you want to offer in that is up to you. You could offer it at $50 a megawatt hour. You could offer it at the price cap of $2,000 a megawatt hour. So some resources will be in the market on a daily basis. Some might not even run once during the whole year. It's not our job to tell them when they're economic to run. It's their job to tell us when they're economic to run. Our only insistence on this is that they must offer into our markets. We must be assured that they are available to produce power if they are called upon and the price reaches the point where they're economic. And in that way, we can always secure and we can always count upon those megawatts when we report back to our standards authorities to meet our reliability standards. DR is very similar. I'm going to try and wrap things up, but we're introducing a capacity-style auction for demand response as early as the end of this year. So there'll be an auction specially for the demand side by the end of this year. And we want to see how that goes. It'll be a slimmed-down version of the full-on capacity auction. So this is just demand response. Peak shaving is traditionally what it's been doing, shaving the peaks. On the hottest days, demand will reduce or curtail in order to ensure that supply and demand remains in balance. So as I said, it will take place towards the end of the year for delivery in the summer of 2016. We're also having some demand response pilots. So the demand response auction is around peak shaving those peaks. Demand response pilots would test the ability of a load or like an industrial facility to respond to 5-minute or hourly dispatch instructions. So depending on how much detail and this is the last slide, depending on how much detail you want to get into, but in pre-dispatch, the load might receive a unit commitment for say 20 megawatts, 3 hours ahead. So they would have to go through all their internal processes, make arrangements to take down that arc furnace or that production line in order to curtail their demand, in this case by 20 megawatts for that 4-hour time block starting at 1 o'clock and ending at 5 o'clock. And this is just an example. There's other ways this would work. And in addition to the unit commitment product they might be able to offer, some of them might be able to offer us an hourly or a 5-minute product, so they'd actually be able to respond to control room signals on a 5-minute or an hourly basis. So in this case, they may be offering 10 megawatts on this hour, 15 megawatts, and then for some reason 5 megawatts, which is higher than this 10 megawatts. Anyways, I didn't do this chart, someone else did, and they got it wrong. But it just gives you an idea of what we're trying to test on the load side. This is something that they currently don't do a lot of. And we believe that there's actually quite a lot of underutilized demand side capability in Ontario. And if we can tap into that, that's a really cost-effective way of meeting our needs without having to build new generation, incur additional investments unnecessarily. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I think looking at the clock, it's just a little bit beyond where I should be. So thank you for your time. I hope I was able to provide some interesting information on what we do at the ISO. It's a really exciting time to be working in the electricity space. If you're thinking about it, it's a really interesting place to work. The ISO is a great organization. It has a few too many engineers, so and not enough economists. But it really is a good organization, and the sector as a whole is a really interesting, great place to work. So thank you for your time.
Tom, thanks very much. You've given us a wonderful overview of the system now and thoughts going forward as well, which has been great. Recognizing that some needed to leave perhaps at 3:30, if you have to go, please don't feel shy about going. We're going to take some Q&A for about 15 minutes now, and then there'll probably be about 10 minutes after we adjourn, and people want to ask a quick question of Tom as well after that time.
Sure.
So be delighted to open it up to questions that you'd like to put to our speaker right now. Yes?
Hi, I'm very interested in energy markets, so I have two questions. First question is, how do you model energy supply and demand? Do you use any statistical models like neural networks to generate forecasts? And second, do you use any weather derivatives like heating degree days and cooling degree days? For example, like Quebec Hydro actually does it because they have different residential rates.
Two questions. One was about modeling in supply and demand. Second was about weather and inputs there.
The modeling is very sophisticated. I don't work in the area that does the modeling. I don't know whether they use neural networks. I know that a lot of time and effort has been put into producing the most accurate forecasts that we can. There was a project that just finished about a year ago on the wind and solar side, was to try and provide forecasts of their output based on conditions that they were facing more in real time, so that our own forecast is going to be as accurate as possible. Inevitably, there are going to be times when the forecasts are wrong, and that's when I was showing that example where you could see demand out of whack with the forecast, or the wind forecast wasn't exactly spot on, when you have to take control actions to try and adjust for any shortfall. And so I'll go back and ask them about the neural networks thing. I don't know the mechanics of it. I just know that we do rely very heavily on the forecasting. And
Do you use statistical models to do that?
I believe so, yes. And on the second question around the heating degree days and cooling, yes, that's an integral part of how we're forecasting demand in the 24-hour time frame. So it will take a weather normal view of that particular day based on historical data, and then we'll be adjusting it for variations in weather and other factors to try and get a truer picture of what demand is likely to be 24 hours out.
Great. Is there another question?
Yeah.
Philip.
So one reason for the introduction of smart meters to 4.5 million consumers was to reduce the peak demands during the time of peak time. So main question was, wouldn't it be easier for you to control the industrial loads instead of 4.5 million, you could control 400? So why do smart meters?
Well,
Question about the motivation for the 4.5 million smart meters in the province.
So first of all, the largest consumers are already active participants in the wholesale market. So they'll be putting bids into the market on an hourly basis at prices where they want to receive a price signal so that they won't be consuming if the price goes beyond, I don't know, $500, $1,000, $1,500. And so you see, especially the energy intensive facilities, the steel companies, those who operate the miners, for example, or the heavy industry, where energy is a significant portion of your total costs, they're already active in the wholesale market, very active in the wholesale market. And we're trying to encourage those in the demand response style programs that we're developing. Now, in terms of smart meters, I mean, smart meters have a number of benefits. I mean, one is they provide consumers with some ability to manage their electricity costs by managing when they consume between the 3 different time periods. They also provide a strong educational benefit to consumers. They are introducing the concept that energy isn't the same price 24/7, and there are periods when it costs more to produce electricity and there are periods when it costs less to produce electricity. So it provides a pretty good stepping stone introduction to that, and potentially to greater participation perhaps in the wholesale market at the lower volume end. And they also provide a lot of benefits for utilities in that the smart meters provide them with much more visibility if there is an area of their territory that's experiencing reliability issues. They can pinpoint with a lot more accuracy the specific households or the communities that are experiencing outages, and they can get their crews to those areas a lot quicker than they would have. In the past, they would have had to drive along the road and see which ones had porch lights were on and which ones were off. Now they can actually get the data directly from the smart meter and pinpoint where the problems are. So smart meters also have a lot of potential. So they're a piece of equipment or a piece of infrastructure that's been rolled out. And I think it's fair to say that things can be done around the various times, the time of use periods. Things can be done around the prices in those periods. So they also have a bit of a platform or a potential to explore different pricing options with consumers in the future too. And they have helped reduce demand during the peak periods. Not a huge number of megawatts, but they certainly provided incentives for consumers to avoid the peakiest periods.
Do you have time for follow-up?
Maybe we'll come back in a second. Others want to come in? Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And just a general question about how do you see the oil price, the coming oil price that we have right now? Do you think the oil price will affect all these scenarios in overall in Canada, more specifically in Ontario, in terms of renewable integration for the wholesale market that we're going to have? Especially as an economist.
So impact of lower oil prices upon the issues the IESO deals with.
So one of the reasons for the lower oil price, there's a number of reasons. One is weak demand in Asian and European economies. But one of the main factors is the surge in supply from shale formations in North America. And the shale oil production, comes with it a lot of natural gas production. So we've seen very low natural gas prices associated with this increase in oil production. So natural gas as a fuel for our natural gas fleet means that they're able to purchase gas at historically very low prices, and they can offer into the market at $20, $30 a megawatt hour, which is really, really good for consumers. It means that the fuel price is very low. I don't think it's deflected. You could argue, well, prices are so low now that maybe it's a disincentive to continue to pursue renewable projects and things like that. In Ontario, the government has set provincial targets for wind and solar, and we're well on the path to implementing those projects. So a lot of those policy decisions have already been made, and the sort of variations in the oil price doesn't have a whole lot of bearing on those objectives. So I don't know if you had any more to your question, or.
No, that's why I just want to know if anything's changing right now in terms of
we just have to be mindful that we don't become overly reliant on, say, natural gas because prices are really low. Markets have been burnt in the past by building out a large gas fleet because they thought low gas prices were here to stay. But the one thing about natural gas prices, that the only true certainty is that they never stay low for very long, and they never stay really high for very long. It's a very dynamic marketplace in its own right, and there's a lot of price volatility. So, sorry, Claudia.
Well, I just had a follow-up question on this. This is going to be huge impact in Quebec, though, with low gas prices. So, could you comment on that? Because I remember the CEO from Ontario Hydro a few years back tried to negotiate with Quebec with selling power to Ontario. They didn't want to know anything about it. Now the thing has flipped. Now Hydro-Quebec is very much willing to start selling power to Ontario because of these problems of selling power to New York. We have all this gas fleet. They don't need their power. So could you comment on that? Maybe not for Ontario, but for other provinces.
Well, Hydro-Quebec, often a bit of a tangent, but is in a bit of a sweet spot. Like, it has abundant hydro with its great resources in northern Quebec, and it has some really interesting markets. Ontario is one of them, and there's New England and New York, and Hydro-Quebec trades a lot of power of its hydropower with these other markets. So it's very interested in selling its hydro into traditional, markets that have a lot of fossil fuel generation. And I think just before the end of last year, the premiers of Ontario and Quebec were talking about, is there more that we can do to take advantage of Quebec's natural resources and Ontario's future needs? And I think that's something that the province is going to continue to explore.
Question, gentleman there?
In the wholesale energy market, so how volatile is the demand response of industrial customers on a daily basis?
How volatile? Actually, it's interesting you say that.
I'm just going to jump in. So the question was about industrial customers in DR and their response.
So industrial loads typically have a much flatter load profile than a residential consumer. So I showed that chart showing demand going up and down. Their profiles are flat. In extreme cases, such as in the pulp and paper industry, they may be inverse. So they may be big consumers during off-peak periods and very price responsive, and they be consuming nothing during mid and on-peak periods. So they're almost the polar opposite of residential consumers in that regard. How responsive they are as dispatchable loads or as demand response resources depends on the nature of the industry. So, a Toyota facility, big consumer, energy really isn't a big part of its costs compared to, say, wages or its inputs. So it doesn't have a lot of interest in participating because it's just not worth its while. But if you go to someone with an arc furnace, a 50 megawatt arc furnace, which is 2 huge electrodes burning metal in a huge pot, those guys are consuming, 30, 50, 60 megawatts an hour. Their electricity bill is in the tens, maybe I think in the over $100 million for the largest consumer in the province. If they can shave 10% off their costs by responding to price signals, that in turn is worth millions of dollars to them as a consumer, and helps the efficiency of their business. So it really does depend on the industry. Some aren't that interested, and some are much more interested.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. So you mentioned earlier that ISO, they forecast the demands beforehand using statistical models, right? So how does ISO plan to deal with challenges with increasing electric vehicles, where it's like a new type of demand that's being introduced to the system?
Yeah, it's good.
The question was about EVs coming into the grid in the system.
In terms of electricity supply, EVs, even at a 20, and I did look at this a while ago, even at a 25, 30% penetration rate, is not a whole lot of additional energy, like in pure output terms, like in terawatt hours. Maybe a few terawatt hours would support hundreds of thousands of EVs. So it's not really an energy supply problem. It's really a distribution problem. It's whether, if we lived on the same street, maybe one of us could have an EV without overloading the local transformer. But if 3, 4, 5 people had an EV, you could start to experience a lot of local area issues because you're overloading equipment that was never designed for like EV charging.
So maybe I should elaborate a bit more. I was actually more, my question was more just to like in the future where we're anticipating like higher penetration of EVs. Does that create any kind of demand or supply problem at all? Where say like all the cars are replaced by EVs in the near future. Is there anything that ISO is doing to prepare for?
Well, I think so. One is it's not really a supply problem from an energy supply. It does create local distribution issues, which are really the responsibility of the LDC, the local distribution, not necessarily. The ISO only deals with the bulk transmission, the large voltage wires, so the 250, the 500 kV lines, as opposed to the 44 and below, which is the distribution. So it's a big problem, potentially a big problem for LDCs that are serving urban environments. But we're actually quite excited by the idea of EVs because for the first time, and you see this in California where there's a trial going on with Tesla, they have about 1,000 homeowners with Tesla stationary batteries installed in their houses as a way of essentially not taking them off the grid, but certainly supplying energy in a different way than historically been supplied. It's always been one way before. Now, homeowners now have options to store energy perhaps off-peak and to charge their vehicles on-peak by using battery technologies, which is really evolving. So I'm actually quite excited, and then certainly as a system operator, the more ability we have to store and control energy, the more comfortable I am as a system operator in controlling the grid, because it's an extra tool.
The thing is, when you have this large-scale penetration at the low voltage level, and you aggregate all of that at the systems level, what is the system impact, and are you looking at that?
It has been looked at. I haven't looked at it from an ISO perspective myself. From the ISO, I see as opportunities as well as challenges. I'm not sure I have a better answer for you right now.
So you mentioned earlier with the California how the storage can be used to supply. Is that the kind of demand response? Is that the direction that the demand response is?
I'm just going to jump in and suggest that this continue.
Okay.
We are happy to talk to you more about it, yeah.
The Waterloo clock, when it says 10 to the hour, people are thinking of their next engagement and so on. So for now, please join me in thanking Tom very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.